while I smiled in that moment, I was like seething with rage. I was so angry. And that gave me the fuel to have a discussion with my manager. I was really nervous, but I knew that I had to say something because it just wasn't right. I did not deserve that kind of treatment. My voice was shaking during my meeting, but I told her this was inappropriate and moving forward, this can't happen again.
Finding her voice and speaking up for herself gave Zynara Ng a new perspective and purpose. Now, as a speaker and public speaking coach, she shares her story to help others discover their own voice and confidence to make changes within their own lives. Thank you for joining Lynn Foley, host of Remarkable Women Powerful Stories, as we hear from Zynara about her journey.
I was born and raised in California, and particularly Northern California, so San Francisco. And I would say growing up, I was a really shy kid. I was born to two Chinese immigrant parents. And so I was really taught to follow the rules and keep my head down, keep really focused. So I'd say growing up for a good, I would say 15 years of my life, I was really, really quiet when it came to being in school and class or interacting with others. But when I was at home, I was just this really, extroverted kid who had so many creative, fun ideas. So it was definitely a big contrast looking back on what I was like. And it wasn't until later on, I'd say maybe in middle school for me that that changed. I had a teacher who nominated me to join part of this leadership program, and that helped me build my confidence. And so from there, I joined a lot of activities at school, being part of drama, which I had loved, being part of the theater, and then sports. So I really came out of my shell, I'd say, around that time.
Mm. So I do know that as you went through secondary school and you went on to college, when you chose what it was you were going to study and maybe what your life was going to be, you had some disappointments as well. So maybe you could talk about the way you chose the study pathway and then some of those disappointments and how they were turning points for you.
Absolutely. I remember after high school, I was part of, theater and drama. And at that time, I thought I was going to be this next big star on Broadway in the theater. And so I decided to go to UC Irvine, and that was in SoCal. So, pretty still far away from home for me, and pursue theater. And I was thinking, okay, we're near Hollywood. That could be a great opportunity to explore this career path. So I remember being so excited. And lo and behold, I'd say within a few months, I saw that becoming an actress or even getting any callbacks from auditions were really hard, even in school. I remember auditioning for several roles left and right. And, coming from where I lived in high school, I would get roles, but then coming to this much larger school, I was a fish out of water. And I remembered being so disappointed that I wouldn't even get called back or looked at twice to be considered for a role. And that was really, really difficult for me. And I think, I was so optimistic and excited. And then it just kind of shook me. And I remember thinking, okay, well, if this isn't working out, is there something else that I can explore? And I remember at that time, I was also interested in the idea of filmmaking and what would it be like if I were to be instead of in front of the camera or on stage, what would it be like if I were to take a look at stepping, I'd say, behind the camera? I really love this idea of telling other people's stories. And so that really drew me. And it really led to me switching basically my major, and I became a film and media studies major. And then my dream then shifted from being in the public eye to being behind the camera and telling people stories. So that was a really interesting unique pivot for me, but it was something that I loved actually. And it's just funny how we have these specific ideas in mind and then life happens, challenges and setbacks happen, but sometimes they can point you in a different direction. And for me, that was a really good direction that I had never anticipated and expected. So I ended up exploring this, and it's actually led to a career as a video producer down the line.
So does that mean you actually shifted your dream, or did your dream manifest in a different way?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would say it's a little bit of both. I would say it's a little bit of both because I think it shifted in a different way. Um, because also I didn't realize I had different interests. Sometimes we're so focused and sometimes it becomes like a tunnel focus and maybe it might shut you off from different opportunities that you had never imagined. And so in some ways I was really glad looking back now that I had those challenges in my first year of, oh my gosh, maybe this isn't the right path for me to take, but in some way I was being shown different paths that I didn't know were available for me and that I had any interest. So I think it's a little bit of both to your question. And I really think that sometimes these challenges lead us to a path that we're meant to take. I do believe in destiny in
Mm,
some, this is always an interesting question of
mm,
do people believe in destiny? And I really truly do. And it comes from following that feeling inside, following that interest, that excitement. And sometimes it's
mm.
hard, but like if there's something there, I think it's absolutely worth exploring and honoring. And that's kind of what happened for me.
So the message there is there about staying open and looking outside that tunnel or that vision that we have or the dream. And it's just looking outside and thinking, oh, well, there's other stuff out there, maybe.
Absolutely. And it sometimes shows up in a challenge or a setback. That's why I don't really believe challenges and setbacks are a bad thing necessarily. Of course, in
Mm,
the moment, they might feel just terrible or
mm.
defeating, but actually it might open you up or it might open us up for a whole new world of opportunities. And that's what happened for me.
So in 2009, that happened to you, didn't it? You had one of those challenges or setbacks in 2009 during as the financial crisis opened up, firstly in the USA and then elsewhere in other countries like ours. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Oh, I sure remember that. That was a really difficult time. I remembered being so excited to graduate. By now I'm in my fourth year and graduating, being a film and media studies major. And since I was in Irvine, it's about an hour away from Los Angeles. So I had all these grand plans. And I thought I was going to move to Hollywood or Los Angeles and somehow make it into, the film industry. And so at that time, I remember just applying to so many jobs. I'd say hundreds of jobs in film in LA and Hollywood. And after applying to hundreds of jobs, I would maybe only get 3 emails or, "Hey, we're interested. Let's have an interview or a chat." But those were dead ends for me too. And so that was a really difficult time for me because I wasn't making any progress. Of course, I had to move home like so many other people after college. It's just really hard to survive anywhere without a job. So, I had to move back home up to the Bay Area. And I just remembered laying in bed, just like feeling really down because I had at that time, I think it was maybe month 6 or month 8 with no prospects, even though I was actively applying to jobs left and right. And I would say the only thing that got me out of this funk and for me to change my perspective and just change actually my life was this book called The Secret. And for those of you who don't know The Secret, it's an amazing book, but The Secret basically has a very simple principle, which is if you believe in something and if you want something, you have to truly believe it. And you have to visualize that and feel the feelings of what it feels like to have it already, even though you may not physically have it. So it's this powerful visualization and energy shift. And when I read it at first of all, I was in a library because I was volunteering at a nonprofit. And I had that book just popped up in my head because I remember a friend in college, she was like so thrilled and so excited. She's like, Zynara, Zynara, you have to read The Secret. And at that time, I thought she was a little off. I was like, okay, yeah, she's maybe in La La Land. I was like, cool, cool. Shrugged it off. She's like, no, it's like an amazing life changing book. And at that time, I wasn't ready to hear it. So I was like, okay, that sounds really fun, weird. Okay, whatever. I thought nothing of it. But for some reason, when I was in the lowest time in my life, which was at that time without a job and working at this nonprofit in a library, that book just popped into my head. I'm like, hey, Zanera, why don't you just check it out in the library? And so I remember just like typing it in. There were 2 copies left. Only one was available. And so I went to the aisle and I was like looking for it. It was hard to find this book and it was somewhere actually not in the right place, but I guess it was meant for me to pick up. And I read it within the day, the same day. It's a very short book.
Mm.
And I remembered at that time my dream job was to work at DreamWorks. And there was this role that I had been applying to for several months. Same role. I sent in my same resume, almost like I'd say maybe once a month. The role hadn't been filled, got nothing. And that was like, okay, well, let me just try and read The Secret and see what this is about. So I read it overnight and then I was like, okay, well, what's the harm in trying it? Let me just try it right now. So
Mm.
that very night, I had imagined that I got this role at DreamWorks. It was a, assistant role to like 4 video producers. It would be a great opportunity. And I just imagined what the DreamWorks office would look like, what I would be wearing, how I would feel walking around the office, what I would be doing, all this stuff, which sounds a bit crazy, but like I was like, what's the harm? And I remember feeling so excited in visualizing and feeling and seeing what that felt like. And so from there, you have to let it go. In the book, it says you after you visualize and manifest, you let it go and just trust that it's on its way. So I was like, all right, let's time to go to bed. And so before I went to bed, I sent off the same resume to DreamWorks that I had been for the last few months, and then um, went to bed. The very next morning, I was driving to this nonprofit that I, mentioned that I work at, and I get this phone call from an unknown number. And I felt this electric shock in my body, this knowing. I can't quite describe it to you. I've only had this feeling once or twice in my life where I had known this is DreamWorks. And I was terrified of picking up the phone. So I let it go to voicemail. And sure enough, listening to voicemail, it was DreamWorks, a recruiter from DreamWorks saying, hey, we saw your application. We'd love to interview you. And when I received that phone call, I was like crying my eyes out just because I didn't realize the power of this manifestation of
Mm.
believing in yourself and believing whatever it is you want that can happen. I didn't know you could think in this way, and I didn't know the power of that. And
Mm.
sometimes I still forget how powerful it is. And so it's only recently again in my life that I'm remembering the power of manifestation and
Mm.
visualization. So that moment changed everything for me. And while I didn't, that's a pretty crazy story of what happens afterwards. But yeah, it was one of those significant moments for me of how I could look at things in a really different way and how things can be possible for me and for everyone else too. And to share this with
Mm.
everyone that I had known afterwards too. But it was a really powerful shift for me.
So did you get the job?
I sure did. I got the job offer. However, at the same time, I was interviewing at Google, which I didn't know was a opportunity for me either. At that time, I was interviewing with DreamWorks. I saw Google and YouTube was the place where people consumed content. So I was very excited to explore what that was, and they had a role open. So I put my hat in the ring, and basically within the same day, I got a phone call from a recruiter at Google and started this process of interviewing. So here I was interviewing at both DreamWorks and Google, and I thought DreamWorks was my dream. But like I mentioned earlier, back just to kind of tie things back, sometimes you have like this vision of what your dream is, but something else presents itself. And what do you do in that scenario? And so as I was interviewing with Google, I realized like everything like lit up for me and talking to the people and learning more about the company and what they were doing at that time. I that was about, I'd say, 2010. I just remembered being in this dilemma because I was like, wait, I thought DreamWorks was my dream. And here I am feeling way more excited about Google. And it was one of those things where I had to follow my intuition again of that feeling that I talked about, those instincts that we often ignore. But I was like, this is growing louder. I think I'm really excited about Google. So basically, when DreamWorks made an offer, I
Mm.
wouldn't find out about Google's final offer until one day after. So I am trying to
Mm.
compromise with DreamWorks saying, "Hey, can you give me one more day? Thank you so much for this offer. I just need one more day before I make my final decision." They knew I was interviewing with Google,
Mm.
and the recruiter said, "No, I'm sorry. We need your answer right now today." And so I basically took the biggest risk in my career at that time, and I basically had to follow my gut and decline DreamWorks without even having a full-time offer from Google. And mind you, it's been months, right? I think we're in month 10 or 11 of no
Mm.
job. So it was a pretty risky
Mm.
move for me. And yet I had to follow this feeling in my gut. And I'm so glad I did because the next day, while I'm on pins and needles on vacation with my family in Hawaii, I could not sleep, eat, or drink anything because I'm just waiting from Google. And then, sure enough, the next day, Google's recruiter offered me the full time position at Google and cried my eyes out, tears of joy. But again, that moment changed everything for me because it's led me to almost 15 years of my career as a video producer in tech, which I didn't know
Mm.
was a possibility for me. So coming back to it again, it's like following these feelings within, these nudges, this internal
Mm.
knowing. It's where you will be led to your happiness and some of that joy. And so for me, that was one of the best decisions I had made in my career by following my gut, even though it was extremely risky to do so, not knowing if I'd have anything at all at the end of the day. So
Mm.
yeah, that changed everything.
So, Zinara, you've had a few turning points, even at that point when you're still very, very young, really, in terms of it. And you took that job at Google, and you followed that dream. So, at the risk of going into something a little bit less positive, uh, as you know, Zonta International has a key focus on raising awareness of and advocating for women and girls and ensuring women's rights are human rights. In your corporate career, you had situations of workplace bullying and prejudice, some of which maybe has come off your background as an Asian American woman. So I'm wondering if you can share one or two of these, but particularly how you worked through it to get a positive outcome. And how do these barriers continue to work against gender equality?
Yeah, I think in terms of some of the more challenging work experiences, I don't know if it's directly linked to me being an Asian American woman, but there are some suggestions that may point to that, right? So I don't know if that was for sure, but there were definitely moments in my career where I really struggled with people who were very difficult to work with. And
Mm.
there's a question of how do you interact with someone who's in a position of power? I remembered earlier on in my career, I certainly had different figures that would come in and out of my life, not even in my career, but also personal life, where there were bullies, bully-like figures. And I would say I really struggled with figuring out how to interact with them. Like I mentioned, growing up, I was taught to not cause a wave or stir anything up. And it was best for me to stay silent. But I remembered in the moments when I stayed silent, how painful that was to not speak up when something was wrong. I remember, several instances where I should have said something, but I was too scared to say something. And at the end of the day, it was at my expense. And so I share that because as I had to figure out how to find my voice, it really was having the courage to speak up and say something when something's not right, especially to people in positions of power. So there was one instance in particular that I remember that really was another pivotal moment for me in learning how to speak up and find my own voice, especially in the workplace. And so I'd say, I'd say earlier on in my career, I had a manager who wanted her team to basically rehearse some slides, a presentation for a presentation for our director. And so for my part, I was really preparing. I had my slides all written. I felt really good about it. I had rehearsed and I had practiced. And so when it came to the run through with my manager and my team, my manager stopped me in the middle of my slides. I hadn't even finished what I was going to say. And she basically raised her voice and started humiliating me in front of everybody, asking me in a very aggressive tone, like, what is this? Why is this here? X, Y, why is this here? And why is that there? And her comments didn't quite make sense, to be honest. But I remembered being so stunned and shocked. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything at that time. And I remember looking around at my colleagues, and no one would make eye contact with me. They felt so uncomfortable that they were looking away. And I remember feeling so ashamed and so embarrassed, but also feeling like that was not right for me to receive that kind of treatment. And so I didn't know how to handle it in the moment, but we ended the meeting. And 30 minutes later, we had to present to our director. And so I had to gather all of myself, even though here I am feeling all these feelings of like anger. I'm feeling incredibly embarrassed, like all these feelings. And I remember I had to like pull it together to present. And so I walked into the room where we had to present to our director. I basically presented the exact same thing that I had done. And my director basically said, Zynara, this was fantastic. And I smiled at that moment, in that moment, because I felt like, yes, like I had known I did a great job. And it was kind of like a validation for me that something was really, really off with what my manager said, that it was not congruent with reality in what happened. And so while I smiled in that moment, I was like seething with rage. I was so angry. And that gave me the fuel to have a discussion with my manager the next day. And so I scheduled something with her on calendar. And I was so nervous to speak to her, by the way, because when you're dealing with people in positions of power, it can be so scary for many reasons because retaliation is a really, really huge concern in the workplace. If you say something, you likely might get fired. There's so many things about that we hear about these kind of horror stories in the workplace, but they're actually very realistic situations that happened. And so I was really nervous, but I knew that I had to say something because it just wasn't right. I did not deserve that kind of treatment. And so I basically, my voice was shaking during my meeting with her, but I told her, you know, I basically outlined what happened. I said, when I presented to you yesterday, this is what I saw, just really outlining as much as I could with the facts of what happened and what she displayed. And then I went in with my boundary and I said, this was inappropriate. And moving forward, this can't happen again. I said, if you have feedback for me, my ask is that you pull me aside in a one on one to share feedback and not share that in this way in front of people. And my voice was shaking, mind you.
So, so is that another example of how you grew that voice, how you stepped into having the strong voice that you now have? It was another event, I suppose, in your life that helped you. How do events like this and many, many others that we could discuss today, how do they continue to create barriers, particularly for women in and us getting towards gender equality? What's your view on that?
That's a really good question. I think this kind of situation is hard because I think maybe the go-to for myself and so many other women would be to like not say anything, to kind of comply and just move things forward, and not stir things up. So I think for sure these types of situations cause huge barriers. But again, for me, in looking back at that situation, if I didn't say anything, it would be a huge expense for my own, just, I don't know, sanity, my confidence, everything. And
Mm,
I knew I had to speak up and say something. And so my kind of advice for other women who are maybe in similar situations would be to have the courage to say something and speak up, because oftentimes we'll know immediately if something's off or
mm,
something's right. And so I would say that would be my advice for other women going through something very similar, is that you
mm,
have to speak up. There's no other way. Otherwise, you're going to be the one who has to deal with the pain of not saying anything
mm.
and the consequence of that when something needs to be said.
So, telling and sharing stories is, of course, one of the ways that we influence the people around us and other women and other girls and other men and other boys, and to get us into causes we believe in. So, how did you get from there to what you do today? Maybe you could give just a short version of what you're doing today. And I know that you're coaching individuals and you work in this space of self belief and growing a voice. So, help us understand your work.
Absolutely. So I'm a public speaking coach, and my goal is to help individuals find their own voices because everyone has a unique story to share. And I want to help people harness that and find that. So that's what I do as a public speaking coach, is to really help individuals find that confidence to speak, whether it is at work or in public settings, whatever that may be. But it's to help them find their own unique voices, because we need more of those voices. And in particular, I love helping women, especially because, again, these voices, when they find their voices, they're extremely powerful. And people are meant to hear these stories. And so, where it comes from truly has been because of my own personal journey of not feeling like I had a voice growing up and not knowing how to find my own voice. And so, it wasn't until, again, some of these challenges, like I mentioned, where I was able to really find my voice. And in doing so, I started figuring out, oh, actually can help others find their voices too. And so in this way of public speaking, it's been such a joy for me and a personal mission to help individuals find that confidence and to find their own voices, because I want people to be able to hear their stories because they're important and they're meant to be heard.
So, what else do you think, as individuals or as collectives of individuals, we can do to halt the regression in women's rights becoming human rights? Because it's my view that it seems to be regressing. Maybe you can share your views or what else needs to be done. The power of the voices, this podcast is all about the power of the voice and sharing stories, a little like you do. But what else can we do? Can I do? Can you do? Can a collective do?
It's such a big question, and sometimes it can feel overwhelming with everything happening in the world. But I'd say starting with ourselves. Starting with ourselves in these situations that we deal with, whether it's personal life, professional life. Is there a conversation we've been trying to hide away from because it's just too difficult? Could that be your chance to actually speak up and say something? Is there, an idea maybe you've been so shy to share in a team meeting that would be a great idea? It starts in these small moments. And I think in speaking up and sharing, whether it's setting a boundary or having a difficult conversation or sharing a cool idea, it it all not only gives you the confidence, it helps change people around you and helps influence others too. If you're at a meeting and you have a perspective or you think something is a little off, oftentimes other people are thinking the exact same thing, but they're a bit too scared to say it.
Mm.
So, I would say it starts with ourselves of speaking up and saying something, because it actually may influence and help other people around you do the same thing.
I'm wondering if some of this is about how we step outside our good girl, the good girl. And it continues to surprise me that women in your age group are still working hard to step outside the good girl um, brackets, almost like a box, a circle. I don't know how to describe it, Zynara, but
Yeah.
I had to. step out of that in my era, but it just surprises me. And so, have you got some thoughts on that good girl versus bold girl, feisty girl, courageous girl?
Yeah. It's such a great, interesting point that you bring up. This idea of like needing to be this, like wanting to be on our best behavior or perceived in a certain way. That's a real thing for women. I definitely have experienced that. And I know that for the majority of my life, that's how I've operated. But it presented with me with so many more challenges and more heartache, to be honest, to play this role, which I didn't really
Mm,
quite fit in. It wasn't
mm,
really me, and it wasn't until I had the courage to break outside of that and start speaking my truth when it was scary, where I felt so empowered. I felt that's where I gained my confidence. That's where I really understood who I was. And it's a constant reminder because society and the ways in which we think sometimes bring us back to that place of like, oh, we must be on our best behavior. We must play this role. But like to remember the pain of that when we have to like
mm,
keep small,
mm,
like the world is large and we have so much space to take up. And that's my encouragement and you know, advice for other women who may struggle with this idea of like, hey, how can I be more of who I am, even if that means breaking the rules and stepping outside of my comfort zone? Because that's where you really find out who you really are. And it's a
mm.
beautiful, beautiful thing.
So the first breakout is for ourselves, and then the second breakout is that, and third and fourth breakout is that glass ceiling we talk about, and which is there. So there are two sets, isn't it? They have to go hand in hand. We have to break out, but also the society and the corporate world and government and policy has to also enable that, by allowing women to uh, break out, I suppose, and be who they are and claim that space and everything you just spoke about. So that shy 15-year-old good girl is now this amazing, courageous, bold, in a very nice way, woman doing great things for other people. What are your greatest leadership gifts? How have these given you the platform to navigate that through line of your life, as I've heard it, of that Asian American woman and learning to use your voice? So I'm wondering what those gifts are and how they've helped you in that through line.
I love this question. I would say the first few things that pop up for me, one of them being empathy. In being a manager for a number of years, but just also who I am as a human, this sense of empathy has allowed me to really understand how other people think and operate and feel. And it allows me to connect with people on a very, very real human connection. Regardless of positions or who you are, it's just a way of how I personally move around in the world. And I'm so
Mm,
proud of that. I'm proud of this piece of really moving around in this world with deep empathy. I would also say my friends would tell me that I'm courageous. I had to ask 5 of my closest friends 3 words about me, of how they would describe me, and I didn't know that that was a word that I would have chosen for myself, but 2 of my friends both said courageous, and now looking back, I would agree because as I shared these stories, it took a great deal of courage for me, and looking back in these big moments in my life, every time that I was scared to do something, but I knew I had to do it, it would take a great deal of courage for me to speak up, but those moments have shown me who I was and who I am, and I am so grateful for the sense that, I'm gonna do it anyway, even though I'm terrified and scared, I'm gonna do it anyway. And maybe last, I would say if someone tells me no, I'm not gonna listen to them. I always find a way. If someone says, "Oh, no, we probably can't do that," I'll always go, "But what if?" I love to reimagine the opportunities. It drives some people crazy sometimes, but for me, that's how my brain works. There's always a way. And I always love to look at the world in a different way, regardless of the limitations that I'm given. I don't believe in them. I mean, they may be there, but I'm still going to work with it and find a different way. And I would say these are the three biggest things that I would say are I would consider my strengths would be.
So, as we wrap up our amazing conversation today, what's the message you'd like to leave with me, but more importantly, with everyone who is listening or watching?
I would say there's no one else in the world like you or me with our set of experiences and circumstances and stories. And people need to hear about them. And so, whatever way that might be, again, maybe it's you telling more about your story to a friend, or again, sharing an idea that you're nervous to share about at work, or setting a boundary. People want to hear your voice. It has to be shared. It's so important to share our own stories and our voices in these different ways. And I tell people it doesn't have to be on this public stage or forum, but it's in these moments that might be smaller. Can you step up and share your own voice or share your story, especially when you're nervous? Because it can inspire others. And more importantly, it'll help you build your confidence and show you who you really are. And so that's what I'd say is for people to step up and share their stories.
Well, you are a living example of the power of storytelling and the power of that being a remarkable woman with such a great story. So I thank you so much for your time with me today and previously. And Zonza International thanks you as well for your generosity.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It was a pleasure being here.